Topic 3. Political and economic change. Comparativists are interested not only in the causes and forms of change, but also in the various impacts that it has had on the policymaking process. Profound political and economic changes have characterized the 20th and early 21st centuries, and governments and politics in all of the 6 core countries of the AP Comparative Government and Politics course illustrate this overall trend toward change. More often than not, political and economic changes occur together and influence one another. If one occurs without the other, tensions are created that have serious consequences. For example, rapid economic changes in China have strongly pressured the government to institute political changes. So far, the authoritarian government has resisted those changes, a situation that leaves us with the question of what adjustments authoritarian governments must make if they are to guide market economies. Types of change. Change occurs in many ways, but it may be categorized into 3 types. Reform is a type of change that does not advocate the overthrow of basic institutions. Instead, reformers want to change some of the methods that political and economic leaders use to reach the goals that the society generally accepts. For example, reformers may want to change business practices in order to preserve real competition in a capitalist country, or they may want the government to become more proactive in preserving the natural environment. In neither case do reformers advocate the overthrow of basic economic or political institutions. Revolution, in contrast to reform, implies change at a more basic level, and involves either a major revision or an overthrow of existing institutions. A revolution usually impacts more than one area of life. For example, the Industrial Revolution first altered the economies of Europe from feudalism to capitalism, but eventually changed their political systems. Transportation, communication, literature, and social classes. Likewise, the French and American revolutions were directed at the political systems, but they significantly changed the economies and societal practices of both countries, and spread their influence throughout the globe. Coup d'etat generally represents the most limited of the 3 types of change. Literally, blows to the state. They replace the leadership of a country with new leaders. Typically, coups occur in countries where government institutions are weak and leaders have taken control by force. The leaders are challenged by others who use force to depose them. Often coups are carried out by the military, but the new leaders are always vulnerable to being overthrown by yet another coup. Attitude toward change. The types of change that take place are usually strongly influenced by the attitudes of those that promote them. Attitudes towards change include: Radicalism is a belief that rapid, dramatic changes need to be made in existing society, often including the political system. Radicals usually think that the current system cannot be saved and must be overturned and replaced with something better. For example, radicalism prevailed in Russia in 1917 when the old Tsarist regime was replaced by the communist USSR. Radicals are often the leaders of revolutions. Liberalism supports reform and gradual change rather than revolution. Do not confuse a liberal attitude toward change with liberalism as a political ideology. The two may or may not accompany one another. Liberals generally do not think that the political or economic systems are permanently broken, but they do believe they need to be repaired or improved. They may support the notion that eventual transformation needs to take place, but they almost always believe that gradual change is best. Conservatism is much less supportive of change in general than are radicalism and liberalism. Conservatives tend to see change as disruptive, and they emphasize the fact that it sometimes brings unforeseen outcomes. They consider the state and the regime to be very important sources of law and order that might be threatened by making significant changes in the way that they operate. Legitimacy itself might be undermined, as well as the basic values and beliefs of society. Reactionary beliefs go further to protect against change than do conservative beliefs. Reactionaries are similar to conservatives in that they oppose both revolution and reform, but they differ in that reactionaries also find the status quo unacceptable. Instead, they want to turn back the clock to an earlier era and reinstate political, social, and economic institutions that once existed. Reactionaries have one thing in common with radicals. Both groups are more willing to use violence to reach their goals than are liberals or conservatives. 3 trends. In comparing political systems, it is important to take notice of overall patterns of development that affect everyone in the contemporary world. Two of these trends, democratization and the move toward market economies, indicate growing commonalities among nations, and the third represents fragmentation, the revival of ethnic or cultural politics. Democratization. Even though democracy takes many different forms, more and more nations are turning towards some form of popular government. One broad, essential requirement for democracy is the existence of competitive elections that are regular, free, and fair. In other words, the election offers a real possibility that the incumbent government may be defeated. By this standard, a number of modern states that call themselves democracies fall into a gray area that is neither clearly democratic nor clearly undemocratic. Examples are Russia, Nigeria, and Indonesia. In contrast, liberal democracies display other democratic characteristics beyond having competitive elections. Civil liberties, such as the freedom of belief, speech, and assembly, rule of law that provides for equal treatment of citizens and due process, neutrality of the judiciary and other checks on the abuse of power, open civil society that allows citizens to lead private lives and mass media to operate independently from the government, civilian control of the military that restricts the likelihood of the military seizing control of the government. Liberal democracies may also be called substantive democracies, where citizens have access to multiple sources of information. Whereas no country is a perfect substantive democracy, some have progressed further than others. Countries that have democratic procedures in place but have significant restrictions on them are referred to as illiberal democracies or procedural democracies. For example, the rule of law may be in place, but it may not be consistently followed by those who have political power. Presidents in illiberal systems often hold a disproportionate share of power, and the legislatures are less able to check executive power. Another type of characteristic of illiberal democracies is that political parties and interest groups are restricted, so that elections lack true competitiveness. The presence of a procedural democracy is a necessary condition for the development of substantive democracy. But many procedural democracies do not qualify as substantive democracies because they are missing the other necessary characteristics. In fact, theorists G. Bingham Powell, Jr. and Eleanor N. Powell do not consider procedural democracies to be democratic at all, but instead view them as forms of electoral authoritarianism. Huntington's three waves of democratization. According to political scientist Samuel Huntington, the modern world is now in a third wave of democratization that began during the 1970s. The first wave developed gradually over time. The second wave occurred after the Allied victory in World War II and continued until the early 1960s. This second wave was characterized by decolonization around the globe. The third wave is characterized by the defeat of dictatorial or totalitarian rulers in South America, Eastern Europe, and some parts of Africa. The recent political turnover in Mexico may be interpreted as part of this third wave of democratization. Why has democratization occurred? According to Huntington, some factors are the loss of legitimacy by both right and left-wing authoritarian regimes, the expansion of an urban middle class in developing countries, a new emphasis on human rights by the United States and the European Union. The snowball effect has been important. When one country in a region becomes democratic, it influences others to do so. An example is Poland's influence on other nations of Eastern Europe during the 1980s. One of the greatest obstacles to democratization is poverty, because it blocks citizen participation in government. Huntington gauges democratic stability by this standard. Democracy may be declared when a country has had at least two successive peaceful turnovers of power. Democratic consolidation. An authoritarian regime may transition to a democracy as a result of a trigger event, such as an economic crisis or a military defeat. Political discontent is generally fueled if the crisis is preceded by a period of relative improvement in the standard of living, a condition called the revolution of rising expectations. These changes demanded may not necessarily be democratic. Democratization begins when these conditions are accompanied by a willingness on the part of the ruling elite to accept the power-sharing arrangements, as well as a readiness on the part of the people to participate in the process and lend it their active support. This process is called democratic consolidation, which creates a stable political system that is supported by all parts of the society. In a consolidated democracy, all institutions and many people participate, so that democracy penetrates political parties, the judiciary, and the bureaucracy. The military, too, cooperates with political leaders and subordinates its will to the democratically based government. A state that progresses from procedural democracy to substantive democracy through democratic consolidation is said to experience political liberalization, which eventually leads other states to recognize it as a liberal democracy. Movement toward economic liberalism and market economies. A second trend of the 20th and early 21st centuries is a movement toward economic liberalism and market economies. Political scientists agree about the relationship between democratization and marketization. Does one cause the other, or is the relationship between the two spurious? Many countries have experienced both, but two of the country cases for the comparative government course offer contradictory evidence. Mexico has moved steadily toward a market economy since the 1980s, and democratization appears to have followed, starting in the late 1980s. On the other hand, China has been moving toward capitalism since the late 1970s without any clear sign of democratization. Political and economic liberalism. The ideology of liberalism has its roots in 19th century Europe, where its proponents supported both political and economic freedoms, and so gave rise to the belief that political liberalism goes hand in hand with economic liberalism. Most liberals were bourgeoisie, middle-class professionals or businessmen, who wanted their views to be represented in government and their economic goals to be unhampered by government interference. They valued political freedoms, such as freedoms of religion, press, and assembly, and the rule of law, and they also wanted economic freedom, such as the right to own private property. They advocated free trade with low or no tariffs, so as to allow individual economic opportunities to blossom. These values clash with those of radicals who emphasized equality more than liberty and generally believed that liberals tolerated too much inequality within their societies. Command and market economies. The 19th century radicals who advocated equality more than liberty included Karl Marx, whose communist theories became the basis for 20th century communist countries, including the USSR and China. In order to achieve more equality, at least in theory, these countries relied on a command economy, in which the government owned almost all industrial enterprises and retail sales outlets. The economies were managed by a party-dominated state planning committee, which produced detailed blueprints for economic production and distribution, often in the form of 5-year plans. Central planning supported economic growth in many cases, especially in the Soviet Union. But by the 1980s, most communist countries found themselves in deep economic trouble. A major problem was that economic growth of major industries had not translated into higher living standards for citizens. Many political economists today declare that the economic competition between capitalism and socialism that dominated the 20th century is now part of the past. The old command economies, with socialist principles of centralized planning, quota setting, and state ownership, are fading from existence, except in combination with market economies. It appears as if most societies are drifting toward market economies based on private ownership of property and little interference from government regulation. This process of limiting the power of the state over private property and market forces is commonly referred to as economic liberalization. The issue now seems to be what type of market economy will be most successful, one that allows for significant control from the central government, a mixed economy, or one that is not, a pure market economy. For example, modern Germany has a social market economy that is team-oriented and emphasizes cooperation between management and organized labor. In contrast, the United States economy tends to be more individualistic and opposed to government control. Two factors have promoted the movement toward market economies are: 1. Belief that government is too big. Command economies require an active, centralized government that gets heavily involved in economic issues. Anti-big government movements began in the 1980s in the United States and many Western European nations, where economies had experienced serious problems of inefficiency and stagnation. Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States rode to power on waves of public support for reducing the scale of government. 2. Lack of success of command economies. The collapse of the Soviet Union is the best example of a command economy failure that reverberated around the world. This failure was accompanied by changes among the Eastern European satellite states from command to market economies. Meanwhile, another big command economy, China, has been slowly infusing capitalism into its system since its near collapse in the 1970s. Today, China is a socialist market economy that is fueled by ever-growing doses of capitalism. Marketization is a term that describes the state's recreation of a market in which property, labor, goods, and services can all function in a competitive environment to determine their value. Privatization is the transfer of state-owned property to private ownership. One important disadvantage of a free market economy is that it inevitably goes through cycles of prosperity and scarcity. Recessions, small market downturns, or even depressions, big downturns happen, but the market corrects itself eventually as supply and demand adjust to correct levels. However, a market downturn may be devastating, as it was during the 1930s when the world went into global depression. This disadvantage of market economies has led many countries to conclude that a mixed economy is the best solution, with the government playing a more active role than it does with a market economy, but a less active role than with a command economy. All economies fall somewhere on the continuum between command and market systems, as illustrated on the graph below. For example, the United States is mostly a market economy, but competition and profit are regulated by the government, so it has some characteristics of a mixed economy. On the other end of the continuum is the former Soviet Union, where the government controlled the economy and allowed virtually no private ownership. Countries may move along the continuum over time. A good example is China, which has moved steadily away from a command economy toward a market economy since 1979. Revival of ethnic and cultural politics. Until recently, few political scientists predicted that fragmentation, divisions based on ethnic or cultural identity, would become increasingly important in world politics. A few years ago, nationalism, identities based on nationhood, seemed to be declining in favor of increasing globalization. However, nationality questions almost certainly derailed Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts to resuscitate the Soviet Union, and national identities remain strong in most parts of the world. Perhaps most dramatically, the politicization of religion has dominated world politics of the early 21st century. Many Westerners have been caught off guard by this turn of events, especially in the United States, where separation of church and state has been a basic political principle since the founding of the country. In the Middle East, political terrorism has been carried out in the name of Islam, and some people believe that many modern international tensions are caused by conflicts between Muslims and Christians. Samuel Huntington has argued that our most important and dangerous future conflicts will be based on clashes of civilization, not on socio-economic or even ideological differences. He divides the world into several different cultural areas that may already be poised to threaten world peace. The West, the Orthodox world, Russia, Islamic countries, Latin America, Africa, the Hindu world, the Confucian world, the Buddhist world, and Japan. Some political scientists criticize Huntington by saying that he distorts cultural divisions and that he underestimates the importance of cultural conflicts within nations. In either case, a world divided into cultural regions or a world organized into a multicultural nations, the revival of ethnic or cultural politics tends to emphasize differences among nations rather than commonalities.